Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are once again updating the Survivor 43 Power Rankings following episode 4, and this was a very interesting episode, as we not only got more screen time for Coco, but we even saw Coco go to Tribal, and the outcome of that was quite unexpected if you ask me, but we'll get into that in a moment. But as usual, there are 15 players left in the game to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 15, we have the boot from this episode, and here we have Lindsay, my winner pick. And I was wrong. I felt like Lindsay had what it took to make a deep run, and I felt like her edit was partially there for her to make a deep run to be a big player. Now, I will say that in hindsight, there was at least some setup for her to have a downfall like this, where going back to the premiere, we saw her talking about in her intro how she was preparing for years to play the game, only to cut to her losing the reward challenge and then her having that confessional of how the game is tougher than she expected. And at the time, I felt like that was going to be set up for a deeper run, how she was going to go back and like start to play the game, get more acclimated. And we did see that later in the premiere where we saw her getting a lot of strategic credit to building the Women's Alliance and then bringing in James. Although even then, we did see her talking a lot about how she wanted to work with James, while James himself never really reciprocated wanting to work with Lindsay specifically, and how that led into his whole "I'm gonna act like I'm the pawn" confessional, which again was probably a red flag as well. But with all that said, despite these warning signs, I did not interpret them as her having a pre-merge boot. And even going into this episode, I wasn't expecting this to be her downfall, but it is. And while the signs were there, I did not see them as such, and I did not expect for her to have a downfall here. Even going into Tribal, where like it seemed like Geo could have been the boot, I felt like Geo was going to be voted out, and that all this paranoia storyline that we saw from her back at camp was simply a decoy, and how it was going to fake us out for what should have been a pretty obvious Geo boot, but it wasn't meant to be. And it really does feel like, from a gameplay perspective, she blew up her own spot. She did seem to be in a good spot with the Women's Alliance and with James willing to work with her at the first vote, until she basically brought it upon herself. And obviously, while I empathize with her in that she was playing this game that she loved only to get paranoid and like get sent out that way, it is still pretty actively bad gameplay and still really bad on her end that she essentially caused her own demise here. But she obviously did get a bit more content this episode, not only with the stuff back at camp before the tribal, but obviously beforehand, where Cody went to raid their camp and she was the one saying how he was going to have to face consequences for him going for the jugular and taking the machete. So she did get some content in the lead up to her tribal here. And ultimately, I was blindsided. I felt like she wasn't going to be the boot despite all those warning signs that were present. But I feel like that's just a reminder that Edgic is not always straightforward. How even when the pieces are there, it's up to us to be able to interpret them accordingly. And sometimes the interpretation is just wrong, and the pieces were there for a completely different reason than what we were expecting. And for me, I was wrong. I picked Lindsay as my winner pick, and I was wrong. I felt like Lindsay had a good enough edit in the premiere, but ultimately that was setting up her downfall down the road. And it's only now that I'm seeing that. So at the end of the day, I feel like Lindsay played, again, a good enough game in the first couple rounds, but when it came time to go to Tribal, she just blew up her spot. And I'm sure stuff will come out in exit interviews and stuff, but based on what we know right now, she obviously played a pretty bad game, and because of that, she is here at number 15. And with that, there are 14 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win the game, based on their edit and current game position. But at number 14, we actually have the person who I had at the bottom of last week's ranking, but here we have Janine. And Janine was pretty invisible in this episode, but I still feel like she is being set up for a downfall soon, where despite all the focus being on Gabler and wanting to target Ellie specifically, I still have this sense that Janine is going to take the fall for this if Baka goes back to Tribal, where obviously Gabler has his idol, so I don't think he's going to be taken out per se. And I could see Ellie trying to get Owen on his side to a degree, but I could also see like that group deciding that Ellie is a decent person to drag along as a shield, and through that, Janine could be taken out as collateral damage. But even outside of that, just her lack of visibility in the edit, the fact that she is so closely tied to Ellie while not getting too much visibility outside that is still a very bad sign to where even if Ellie's taken out like over her at the next tribal, I still don't think she's gonna win. And because of that, I have her here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have the person who I thought was going to be the boot coming into this last tribal, but here we have Geo. And I feel like Geo's fate is going to be largely dependent on if Coco goes back to tribal in the pre-merge. If he does, I feel like he is in a lot of danger. And I know I said before that I felt like for a while that Geo would probably stay over Ryan. However, at this point, I am leaning more towards Geo going out if Coco goes back to tribal soon. Now, if Coco does manage to make it to the merge without going to tribal, I could see him slipping on by as we'll talk about with Ryan in a moment. I feel like Ryan would more likely be targeted at the post merge than Geo. But I feel like in the current state of things, Geo is in a worse position than Ryan. And I feel like he probably will be an easy boot if Coco goes back to tribal soon, even with Carla's situation. And the fact that Carla's relationship with Geo has not been as emphasized lately is a bit of a worry as well. Although I feel like it could have played a factor into the vote here, where she did seem to be fully on board with taking out Lindsay, like without too much thought there. And that could be a factor if Coco goes back to tribal soon, but I don't think it's particularly likely. And on top of that, Geo wasn't even included on the Lindsay plan, where he still votes for Cassidy. He just wasn't left in on the vote, which I feel like is really bad. And the fact that he doesn't even get to explain how he is able to defend himself here is another pretty massive knock, to where I don't feel like he's a likely winner, even if he does survive beyond the next tribal. So because of that, I do have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone I literally just mentioned, but here we have Ryan. And Ryan was, at least in the majority on this vote, he did vote out Lindsay, although he didn't seem to clue in Geo to the plan, and that's a pretty big knock there. And the fact that Ryan wasn't even discussed much as a key player in the vote is not a great sign as well. And I feel like moving forward, again, Ryan's probably not in the best spot. Now, as I said a moment ago with Geo, I feel like if Coco does go to another tribal in the pre-merge, I feel like Ryan could skate on by there. I could see him being seen as more valuable. However, if Coco does make it to the merge, I could see Ryan being an early merge boot. He does seem to be getting this setup as a pretty big character, as judging by his premiere and him getting occasional content. However, it doesn't seem to be set up towards him winning. Not to mention the fact that Carla did say in episode 2 that she was specifically worried about Ryan getting close to Geo more than anything else, which could lead to Carla flipping on Ryan as well. So mixing in his current game spot, which I don't think is ideal, along with his edit, I don't think Ryan is super long for the game past the merge, but it's the fact that he is a bit more likely to survive a tribal if Coco goes back to tribal soon compared to Geo, that does have him one spot higher. And because of that, he is here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have someone who I remain very conflicted on, but here we have Gabler. And Gabler went back to having a pretty mixed episode where he got plenty of negativity early on with him putting the pawn fronds on the others while they're sleeping, which wasn't great. He was also shown getting in an argument with Ellie, and we did get more setup towards his rivalry with Ellie. And through that, I feel like that's not particularly great. Now, he does get to talk a bit about how if Ellie gets too far, they will regret it, which is something at least. And if Baka does go back to tribal, I mean, he does have his idol he could play, so I think he'll be safe for this next vote. But at this point, I don't think he's a very likely winner. I feel like so much of his storyline at this point is wrapped around his rivalry with Ellie. And sure, while that could mean he could be the one that takes Ellie out, I don't see his path beyond that. He doesn't seem to have much beyond just simply taking out Ellie. And with there being a number of other big players on the board, I don't think that's great for Gabler. And with all this negativity, I think he is a very unlikely winner. Now, at this point, I do think he could make it decently far. However, with the way he's been playing, I could see him being dragged to the end. I could also see him being taken out as a consensus vote, maybe in the early merge. I feel like there's a number of ways Gabler could go in terms of longevity, But at this point, I feel pretty safe in saying that he's probably not going to win. But with him not having as many issues and as many longevity concerns as the people we just mentioned, I did have him a couple spots higher, and because of that, he's here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I again just mentioned not too long ago, but here we have Ellie, and Ellie is obviously being set up for a downfall once again, with her talking more about Gabler, and Gabler in turn talking about her, and it's not looking great for her. And I feel like if Baka goes by the tribal, I feel like it's either going to be her or Janine, who is her closest ally at this point, which is not great. Now, I do feel like Ellie has more longevity in her edit than Janine, which is why I do give her the edge in that regard. But aside from that, I don't feel like Ellie is getting to the end. I feel like she is someone who, even if she's successful in getting out Gabler, I feel like she's going to be such a major threat out there that she's not going to be long for the game beyond that. And plus, there's other people like Owen and Sammy who I feel like are very likely to flip on her if given the opportunity. So at this point, I don't think Ellie is getting to the end of the game. But with that said, I feel like she is being set up for more longevity than some of the people we already talked about, which is why I do have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone else who I don't feel that confident in winning the game, though I do feel like they have a bit of longevity behind them. But here we have Dwight. And the thing about Dwight is kind of similar to Gabler. A lot of his storyline at this point is centered around this rivalry, this time with Jesse. And through that, I feel like Dwight doesn't have too much of a storyline beyond that. Now, I also think Dwight will probably lose that battle against Jesse, although I don't think it'll necessarily translate to him being the next boot, as I think Noel is more likely to be voted out if they go back to tribal before the merge. Now, something else I am a bit worried about with Dwight is, similar to Ryan, he could be an early merge boot based on all the content he's been getting, but also based on how undermined he's been. I think Dwight is a pretty likely merge boot if I'm being perfectly honest, but if not, I could see him like being taken along for a bit, but not really having too much of a shot of winning the game. I don't think he's particularly well respected out there, even if people seem to like him. And I do think he'll lose the battle at the end of the day against Jesse. So ultimately, I don't feel that great about Dwight, and I do think he has some longevity issues, like particularly with some of the danger spots coming up soon, but I still think there's enough there, particularly compared to the other people, that I did have him a bit higher, and plus his relationship with Noel is at least something, but it's not enough to have him much higher than number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have someone very similar to Dwight, but here we have Noel. And admittedly, I've been a bit too low on Noel so far throughout the season, as I didn't really feel like there was too much to glean based on her edit, and plus she hasn't been in the best game position so far, and even now I still think she's in a pretty poor position to, despite having her having this vote steal, I feel like Cody's idol would basically override that to where she would probably be voted out in that situation, which isn't great. But the main reason I have her at least this high and higher than Dwight is I feel like if she's able to make it to the merge without going back to tribal, I think she has a decent amount of potential to make it deeper in the game than Dwight. Now, granted, I don't feel like she's a particularly likely winner, but I still feel like there's enough of a potential storyline there with her being an underdog, with her climbing her way back from the Justine vote, that I could see a world where she becomes a contender. But I feel like for now she is more of an outside contender, which is why I have her here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and this person did drop a decent amount after this episode, which is interesting considering this is the first episode where they've gotten at least some screen time. But here we have James. And I realized in previous episodes, James did not get the most screen time in the world, and there were definitely some issues I had with his edit. However, I assumed that before this episode that Coco could have been the Luvu of the season, in that they barely go to tribal, they don't really have to vote anyone out, which is why they haven't been getting as much screen time. And with us seeing like someone like Deshawn or Erica not getting too much screen time in return, I feel like Coco's lack of screen time before this episode wasn't too much of an issue for who I consider the top contenders, with James of course being one of them. But obviously in this episode we did get to see James getting more screen time, and I'm just going to say it, I think James did not look that great in this episode. he obviously like talks about during the raid how they can't afford to lose the machete and that he and his tribe should do anything to make Cody not take the machete. But then that's undercut when Cody says that this was exactly his plan, how he's using his sales background to basically ask for a lot, but then like when they balk, he asks for something slightly lower than that, but still quite a lot, but then they just give in to that because it's not as bad as what it could have been. So I feel like through that, James got pretty undermined there. And then with the vote, I mean, he votes out someone who attempted to build a close bond with him in Lindsay. And I don't think it was the correct strategic decision to do so. Where I get that Lindsay was being paranoid, but Lindsay was still someone that was willing to work with James moving forward, and him cutting her this early is not great for him. Now, granted, I don't feel like he is going to be harmed in the long run based on that, but I still feel like he made the suboptimal move there, and I do question how it's going to factor into his edit, as that could have been a potential long-term relationship, a potential significant relationship for his edit. But for him to just cut that so early in the game is pretty bad. So on the whole, I was not that impressed by James in this episode. Now, granted, the one argument I should bring up is the fact that okay, some of this could tie into his edit from the premiere where he talks about how he wants others to feel like they're the pawns and that like he's going to be the king by the end of it. And I did use that to excuse him to a degree in the last episode with him unwittingly inspiring Carla to go back and reclaim the beware advantage. And then obviously this episode was kind of similar with Cody like feeling like he's the mastermind by like manipulating the Cocos into getting quite a lot from them during the raid. And to be fair, that still could be his storyline there. However, the more that I think about it, I mean, now that we're seeing this again, I feel like this doesn't feel as intentional as James is making it out to be. And to be fair, it's probably not actually that intentional, but it's still at least something that could tie into a storyline. And plus, the main reason I have him at least this high is that I feel like he has a lot of longevity. I'd be shocked if he goes out anytime soon, and I expect to see him in the end game. But at this point, there are just so many holes in his edit that I can't put him too much higher than here. Now, granted, I still think he's one of the more likely people to make it to the end game, but with the holes cracking up in his edit, I wouldn't be surprised if he gets to the end and people don't respect him, or he doesn't make the correct moves that allow him to win the game. So because of that, I can't have him higher than number 7 here. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty interesting entry to talk about here. But here we have Cassidy. Now, am I that confident Cassidy's gonna win? Not exactly. I know people compare her a lot to Erica and that she talks about wanting to be a fox, and she has not been the most prominent in the game talk so far. Where even in this episode, while she does vote in the majority to take out Lindsay, it did seem like James and Carla were more the decision makers there, while she was a number for that side. However, considering her edit, I feel like she's been a bit more prominent in the edit compared to Erica, which considering her storyline of being a fox, like in the background, which is not ideal, but to be fair, her actual confessionals don't really like pop out as much, where a lot of them do feel pretty generic. Even in this episode, she talks about how she wasn't expecting Cody to go to them versus Baka, and how Geo is annoying, which again are pretty baseline for the most part, don't really jump off the page as like too winner edit like. Even so, I feel like compared to the rest of the people on Coco, I feel like she is someone who doesn't have as many flaws in her edit, where even though she isn't the highest ranked Coco member, I feel like she has quite a bit of potential to make a deep run here, considering her edit. Now, again, it wasn't great she was targeted in this episode by Geo, though again, the numbers were on her side. So, I feel like when looking at Cassidy, I think she is someone who, again, has some minor positives here or there. And while I do see the comparisons to Erica's edit, I don't exactly think it's going to turn out quite that way, though it's not impossible either. So when looking at all that, I did decide to have her at least this high on the list. Although I feel like a lot of that's because the other people have more negatives to their edit than Cassidy does. But I feel like the top 5 people are people I have a bit more confidence in pulling out the win, which is why I leave her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have someone a little similar to Cassidy, though I have been higher on this person throughout the season. But here we have Owen, who didn't really have much in this episode. Again, wasn't really that focused on, But even so, I still think he's going to be a big player down the stretch. He is seeming to be in the middle of this Gabler Ellie debacle. And if that comes to a head soon, I feel like he'll be the deciding force there, which I do think is a positive for his edit. I also think he is, again, going to be a big strategic force later on in the game. And with him not getting as much personal content, I feel like he's probably not going to be as seen as a target compared to like an Ellie or even a Carla, if I'm being honest. Though I could still see him being taken out around the final five spot, kind of like a Ricard or Lindsay, where despite him not getting that much personal content, he is shown being a pretty big jury threat, someone people will recognize as being that jury threat, but not really having much of the edit to back up him actually scraping on through that. So at the end of the day, I don't think Owen is too likely either, though I do feel like he has more of a case to win than Cassidy. So because of that, I do have him here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and for me, these top 4 are pretty definitive. I feel like these 4 have the strongest cases to win right now. Although I feel like each of them have issues. I don't feel like anyone in particular is getting a perfect winner's edit so far. And at number 4, we probably have the person whose edit was the most circumstantial here, but here we have Cody. And obviously, this was a very solid episode for Cody with his entire situation going on the raid and getting all of the stuff from Coco. Now, he did seem to be on board with taking the machete early on, only for Coco to push back. And we even hear like people like Lindsay and other people in Coco saying that this will be drawing a line in the sand if they cut him off at their knees here, which Cody's willing to take. But even then, we do see him using his sales tactics here, where he is asking for the most crucial thing in their machete, and then when they push back, he takes a slightly lesser option in taking the fishing gear, which is still a pretty big grab. But obviously, Coco's more willing to go along with that. And he even says that this is part of his sales tactic, that he is over pitching in order to make his second offer, which was probably his original offer, seem more appetizing to the Cocos, which is pretty good there. And he is pretty successful, and he is propped up quite a bit for that. Although even then, like, there are two things about that. One is obviously the fact that he is going on the raid to begin with, so obviously that's circumstantial content. But the other thing is, at the end of the scene, we do hear from Carla how Cody is a big player and that there is a potential rivalry set up in that regard. So, it's not perfect either. But really, I think Cody has solidified himself as a pretty solid contender, where I feel like he's had a pretty solid first couple of episodes. But again, it's not perfect. I mean, for one, he is a pretty big character. He is a pretty big, larger than life character. I also don't love how in episode 2, when he opens Beware Advantage, how Jesse went out of his way to say that this was a stupid move of Cody, even though he was able to succeed in getting all the beads. And then obviously the main factor is I do feel like he will be at least in some danger coming into this next tribal, where I do expect Dwight and Noel to at least consider targeting him. But even then, we obviously know he has an idol, so there is that. So I still feel like Cody will be a pretty top contender. I think he's gotten a pretty good mix of strategic and personal content over the course of these first couple of episodes, to where I feel like he will be a solid contender moving forward. But again, there are still issues with his edit, and I do expect him to face plenty of adversity along the way. So because of that, I do have to leave him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we have the person who probably has the most perfect edit right now. But if you have seen my previous power rankings, you should probably know that that is probably more of a red flag than anything else. But here we have Carla. And again, Carla has probably gotten the best edit so far, where she has gotten consistent content across all 4 episodes, despite being on Coco, which has not gotten as much screen time as the other tribes. She has gotten plenty of strategic and personal content across each of the 4 episodes. She benefits the most from the Lindsay boot here, despite her not getting the most credit for that move. I feel like on the show, at least, James was shown more being the one to flip there. Although I feel like Carla was a pretty integral part of that move as well. And I do feel like it is a better move for Carla than it is for James here. So there's that. And I feel like she's being set up for future storylines as well. She also got the confessional after Cody left the raid, where she says that Cody is overplaying and how he is someone that shouldn't be trusted. So there's also that. And on paper, Carla would be the clear winner. However, as I talked about in my 42 ranking, I don't think this is going to translate to a win. I feel like Carla is being very clearly set up as the Omar of the season, where she gets a pretty glowing winner's edit for a lot of it, but is eventually seen as this massive threat who is taken out. And I feel like rather than being the winner herself, Carla will be the biggest obstacle for the actual winner to overcome in order to win the game. So through that, I can't put Carla at the very top, as I don't feel like they're going to make this person the winner with this style of edit. But with that, all that said, I kind of have to put her this high simply due to the evidence that we have, considering all the issues that I have had with most of the people on this cast, and with no one really having an edit that I feel like would be a slam dunk to win. I feel like Carla has the most evidence to back up her longevity in the game, but also her being a potential winner. But with that said, I don't feel like she's actually going to win. I feel like she will be a big threat that is eventually taken out. And because of that, I do have to leave her here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we actually have the same top 2 as last week. However, after thinking about it a bit more, I did decide to switch the order. So at number 2, I do have Sammy. Now, I'll admit I probably overreacted to Sammy being number 1 last week, but I still feel like he has a lot of the merits there to back up his deep run, but also him being a potential winner. However, after thinking about it some more, I did start to wonder if maybe Sammy is someone who would be a losing finalist. I know I'm not the only person who has brought this up, but if we're looking at previous seasons, we obviously have Mike from 42, who in the pre-merge had a pretty solid edit, and did seem for a while that Mike was going to be this top winner contender. But then later on, as the season went on, we did start to see Mike getting undermined, and we did start to see more of his flaws pop out to the point where it did seem like he was probably going to get to the end, but not actually win. And a part of me wonders if Sammy is on a similar trajectory. And again, I know I'm not the only person who has brought this up. I've seen posts about this on Reddit. However, I do have to go back to my preseason assessment of Sammy to a degree, where I said at the time that I felt like Sammy could be someone who makes a deep run, but that gets to the end and doesn't have too much respect. And I think that's still a possibility, where despite him having the content for Winner's Edit, there could be flaws that could crop up later on. And it was definitely that reflection, but also seeing him in this episode where I felt like it wasn't that bad of an episode for him. He did get a checkup. However, even then, he does say that Gabler lacks awareness, only for Gabler to lay out the fact that both he and Ellie are strong personalities and that they don't trust each other, which to me did seem to be a bit of awareness. So I felt like Sammy was slightly undercut there. But obviously, going back to his premiere, there were also similar issues with that. So it's not as if Sammy has gotten a perfect winner's edit either. And it's not that I've ignored those per se, but I definitely started to think more over time about what all this could be leading to. And I feel like through that, Sammy is someone who will definitely have a deep run, someone who has the potential to make big moves and potentially win, and someone who has the storyline to back up their winner edit. So I don't doubt that Sammy will make a deep run. However, I am also starting to more fully recognize the range of possibilities. And I think there is a possibility that he could be undercut later on. And while there aren't as many blatant issues with his edit as other people, I think there are still tiny issues that you could point to that could grow over time. So because of that, I did decide to bump Sammy down just a little bit, but I still feel pretty good about his chances long term. And it's because of that I have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 43 right now is Jesse. And it's kind of similar to Sammy, I did think a bit more about Jesse's edit as well. Where to me, the big issue I have with Jesse is whether he's going to be a big threat, kind of similar to what we're seeing with Ellie and to a degree with Carla as well. And I still think that, and I still feel like there are still some issues with Jesse's edit, namely this rivalry with Dwight that could get in his way to a degree. But after thinking about some more, I do feel like that Ellie and Carla are both such blatant big characters that will be targeted later on that it kind of lowers Jesse's own threat level to a degree. And through that, I'm probably not as concerned about Jesse being targeted later on for being this big threat compared to what I felt about him earlier on. And I still feel like he is getting a good edit here, where in this episode, he gets to talk about turning things around, about winning reward. He talks about how the old Jesse would have gone for the jugular with taking the machete during the raid, but now he's trying to be a bit more diplomatic. And again, kind of undercutting Cody with him like trying to take a more calculated approach. And then, of course, we do see Cody getting his way. So, again, not ideal. But even so, I still feel like Jesse will probably be in it for a while. And I still feel like he's going to be a big character, someone who is getting both personal and strategic content. And of these quote unquote big characters, he is still the one that I feel like is the least likely to be targeted later on in the game. And with Vessi being propped up as a decent tribe, probably the complex tribe of the season, I think that definitely benefits Cody and Jesse as well. But I feel like after this reassessment, I feel like I did decide to switch my placement with Jesse and Sammy to have Jesse at number one this week. Now, again, I still feel like there's still issues with these people's edits. I don't feel like anyone has a perfect winner's edit. And even the one person with the least issues in their edit, that being Carla, I still feel like that person's going to be targeted later on. So with that, I do have to look at everything else. And I feel like right now I am kind of leaning a bit more towards Jesse again. And yes, I do acknowledge that this could change moving forward. But after this episode, I did decide to have Jesse here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so stay tuned for that. I am also covering The Amazing Race 34 as that is coming out, so I expect more power rankings from there. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.